and there's a key that must be cold because it shrunk into the case. But since I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived, I'm gonna make this laptop. Responsibility of the owner is to make sure those vents stay unobstructed. Well, it's a good thing they found me, since I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived. So I'm gonna test it myself and slap in a working CPU, which I don't have. And where does the greatest technician that's ever lived get his parts and computers from? My friends right down the street at Trident Electronics Recycling, also known as the greatest electronics recycler that's ever lived. The power switch was plugged in. Tiny raccoon-like fingers activated. Okay, for real this time. Something greatest technician. Time to test. Was that the problem? Of course it was, because I'm the greatest technician that's ever. Just kidding, it's still fucked. But I'm very thankful for that job because it helped mold me into the greatest technician that's ever lived. My shop, I try it out myself so I know I can stand behind it. It's the reason I refuse to sell cheap consumer-grade laptops and sell used business laptops instead. Because if the greatest technician that's ever lived. And check out this volume knob. I wonder how loud this can actually get. The greatest technician that's ever lived. And for the very first time in the life of the greatest technician that's ever lived. But because I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived. So we can see if that duct-taped SSD is as deep-fried as the greatest technician that's ever lived. Is it must know it's in the presence of the greatest technician that's ever lived. A trait that eventually molded me into the greatest technician that's ever lived. One of the many accomplishments of the greatest technician that's ever lived. So, I'm just gonna hold on to this relic until the day I become the greatest technician that's ever died. Whoever did this hack job is far from being the greatest technician that's ever lived. Stop and read these directions. Just kidding. I don't need directions because I'm the greatest technician that's ever lived. And who does my customer trust to do the job? Well, none other than the greatest technician that's ever lived. So let's see what happens when I remove it and slap in another drive. Moment of truth. The greatest technician that's ever lived. So if something does go wrong, you don't have to be the greatest technician that's ever lived. Well, everything looks good after a stress test. Now it's time to clean it up and tell the customer
the greatest technician that's ever lived
has completely fuck. But have no fear, for the greatest technician that's ever lived. But unlike me, this customer still has hope that the greatest technician that's ever lived. The greatest technician that's ever lived. And this is the reason I only sell business-grade laptops at my store, because the greatest technician that's ever lived. And when the greatest technician that's ever lived. Because once word got out that the greatest technician that's ever lived. And of course, since I'm this giant piece of speed is in my shop today because it's getting a new GPU. And not just any GPU, but the greatest GPU that's ever lived. After connecting it directly to the local power plant, it's time to test.
For the greatest technician that's ever lived.
Since I caught mesothelioma just looking at it, I need to take it outside and clean it before the greatest technician that's ever lived. But it also means it sucks harder than the greatest technician that's ever lived. And this device is no match for the greatest technician that's ever lived. The cover pops up faster than you can lower your volume when I bass boost the greatest technician that's ever lived. Now it's been a long time since the greatest technician that's ever lived. This visitor from Planet Lint must have heard that
the greatest technician that's ever lived.
And last but not least, the game that helped mold the greatest technician that's ever lived. For those of you who don't know, Rich Rebuilds is a very small YouTuber, and he begged the greatest technician that's ever lived. Alright, let's plug in this doghouse and check those temps. The greatest technician that's ever lived. Alright, let's go. Now that is suddenly energized, made by some weirdo that calls himself the greatest technician that's ever lived. So, after making some slight modifications to force this 3-slot card into the 2-slot adapter, I power it on and start my journey creating the greatest mini PC that's ever lived. As for temps, the fan screams louder than your mother when the greatest technician that's ever lived makes a house call to defrag her hard drive. I can be the greatest technician that's ever lived. But before little Timmy gets his hands on this 17-inch bazooka, they wanted the greatest technician that's ever lived. We all know that doesn't mean anything to me because I'm 2 other shops told him it was fucked and he wanted the opinion of the greatest technician that's ever lived. An 8-year-old 5400 RPM mechanical hard drive. And just like the greatest technician that's ever lived, these drives were born slow. But unfortunately, even the greatest technician that's ever lived couldn't get it to power on. And even though this helped mold me into the greatest technician that's ever lived, and just like the father of the greatest technician Now, I've replaced hundreds of these, so of course this job is no match for
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
Well, my inability to spot signs of motherboard damage is what makes me
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
because it's very involved, but of course being
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
it's no problem for me. I'll go down face first on a hot surface, just like
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
this is what years of binging anime looks like. Something knows all about. Anyways, since
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
it's crashing and unstable, two things
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
knows all about.
Yo, wasabi. It's upside down.
About any issues.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
Backbreaker, a wrestling move that el mejor técnico que ha vivido, which is a must when you're
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
it's just as easy as convincing you that I'm
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
big old motherboard is fucked. So I'll have to send it in to somebody who's actually
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
I do possess the skills of
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
reassemble everything and
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
a quality that was passed down to and just like
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
it packs a lot of heat, so I can watch my tentacle poetry in all its glory because only enjoys the finest things in life. I also have a motto. Neither pubes nor dust, nor skeet nor hair shall keep
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
from doing repair. Just like
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
resides rent-free in your head. You don't have to be.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
Please, laptop manufacturers, for the love of
The greatest technician that's ever lived. The greatest technician that's ever lived.
because no toothbrush in the universe is safe from
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
It's a really high-end virtual reality headset. It's
The greatest headset that's ever lived.
and logging into.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
Thankfully, repair shops like mine still exist, so
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
you don't need to be.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
Now you don't have to be.
The greatest technician that's
Ever lived.
And being
the greatest technician that's ever lived. The greatest technician that's ever lived.
only sells the greatest laptops ever made.
The greatest technician.
You don't need the tiny raccoon-like fingers of.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
Now that I have my new tools to match my new shirt, it's time to transform into.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
And given my current rate of mental decay, this may even outlast.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
So with the snap of a finger, I transform from
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
into the Gooch Collector. But what do I know? It's not like I'm.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
And because it took me far too long to realize why I had no display on first boot.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
It's quite pricey. Unless, of course, you're.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
I decide to remove the motherboard to see if the top case is shorting it out when moved.
The greatest technician that's ever lived.
No one ever saw me cry until I left the party the other night. Do you remember all the things that you said to me that came out of his mouth automatically?